So our story now begins with Henry VII. He's the first of the Tudor kings. Before I start, I'll give a little bit more background about that period before the Tudors, because I didn't give very much detail before. You've probably heard of something called Barasingso, the Wars of the Roses, and that's the basic background to Henry VII. The Wars of the Roses lasted for 160 years or so, and they all started because of this man, Edward III. Edward III was a very powerful king, not a very nice person. He did lots of pretty nasty things, and he had basically two children who went on to generate the Wars of the Roses because each side was fighting for control of the country. This went on for 160 years. So, Edward III, as I said, he was a powerful king, and this was the time when England became a powerful country in Europe in the 14th century. And then what they called the Wars of the Roses came because of Edward's son John on the one hand and his other son Edmund on the other. And these two families kept on for 160 years fighting for control of the country. So it wasn't like Kyakurokuju Nenkan Zutto, okay, they were fighting. It was a little bit of fighting, then peaceful for a while, then more fighting, then peaceful again, and this continued for 160 years or so. And basically, this is the sort of late Chuseijidai, the late Middle Ages in England, is dominated by these two families fighting for control of the country. And we've got this one was the family of Lancaster, the House of Lancaster. This one was the family of York. They were called the House of Lancaster and the House of York. And our Henry Tudor was on the Lancaster side. And the last of the York kings was Richard III. Now basically what happened was that in the last battle of the Wars of the Roses, Henry's army won, Richard's army lost, Richard was killed, Henry became the king. Marrying, I don't know who his brother was, but marrying his niece, okay? All right. Okay. He killed Richard and married Richard's niece. In this way, he united the two families, and Baratinso, the Wars of the Roses, came to an end. Richard is portrayed in one of Shakespeare's plays, and he's remembered in history as a bad guy. How true this is, we don't know. All right? One part of the story of Richard is that he had a hunchback. Okay? So Richard III with a hunchback. The other side to the story is that he did something really horrible to his nephews. Now, niece, okay, he also had two nephews, two little boys. Okay, two little boys. And when he became king, they stayed, that he was frightened that they would grow up and challenge him for power to become king. So he locked them up in the Tower of London. They were prisoners, and one night he came to kill them. I'm not really sure. It's what Shakespeare writes about. Shakespeare believes that version of history. He writes it like that. And so, okay, Richard III, all right? Got a hunchback, and you my nephew. Say no. You my nephew. Say no, because maybe I'm going to kill you. All right? Okay? He killed, he killed his nephews. So, are you Richard III's nephew? Okay, the two nephews, according to the story, were killed by Richard. And actually, we did find, or archaeologists did find the bones of Richard, and they found that honto deshita. But it was like on one side, like here, on his shoulder, not right on his back. He did have something on his shoulder. They found his bones in an old car park. Okay? That. Okay? They found his bones in an old car park 6-7 years ago. All right? And they found that it was indeed true, and there are pictures of the time as well. Look at this picture. Look at his shoulder here. All right? And it seems that it is true that he had his back like that. So Henry defeats Richard. Richard is killed. Henry marries the niece and becomes the new king. And by marrying somebody from the other family, he joins the two families together. And he starts a new Jidai. It's the Tudor period now that begins with Henry. So his marriage to Richard's niece, Elizabeth, ends the Wars of the Roses, and it unites the two houses. Now, you might think it's a little bit strange, you know. He's like, Elizabeth, oji-san no koto. Gomen. And she's like kind of, listen to you. Okay? This kind of thing happens quite a lot in this period. People kill other members of your family, then you marry them or something like that. Okay? So even though he killed her uncle, she would seem quite happy to marry him. Maybe she didn't like her uncle either. Maybe she was fighting with him. Maybe it was true that he killed his nieces, her brothers. Okay? So the Wars of the Roses come to an end, and we begin our early modern period. Of course, you know, when we say Chuseiji Daiga Warimashita, early modern period, and it's not like everybody wakes up at, you know, in the morning and says, oh, you know, Chuseiji Daiga Wanda, Korekara, early modern Jidai. It's not like that, of course, but for our understanding of history, we take different times. One is 1450, all right, and the other one is the beginning of his reign, all right, in 1485. So somewhere around then, society was changing, the culture was changing, the political situation that we'd had for over 150 years, that political situation ended, and a new period began. There were several things that were changing at this time. Late 15th century. Let's have a look. We often would think of this as being more or less the end of the Middle Ages. One thing that's changed is the language. All right? We can't really talk about two separate languages at all. For a long time, the two languages were slowly mixing. Okay? And then they mixed some more. But by now, everybody really was speaking one language. There weren't two languages anymore. The French language and the English language had mixed together pretty much completely. Educated people would use more French, uneducated people would use more Anglo-Saxon. But basically, it was all one language with one grammar. It was one. There were no two different languages at this stage. What else did we have? The Normans, the Normans also didn't exist. People today will say, well, I'm basically Anglo-Saxon. People today will say, well, I'm basically Celtic. Or I'm Anglo-Saxon with a Celtic grandmother. Or, you know, we can see the difference today between Celtic and Anglo-Saxon. But nobody will say, I'm Norman, or it's pretty unusual. There are some families which have continued since Norman times. Okay, but nobody really would say, I'm Norman. They consider that their blood was so mixed in that they were basically Anglo-Saxon. There weren't very many of them. So over a period of time, they basically just mixed in with the Anglo-Saxon people. The high class, the noble class, the daimyo class, had become weak through the Wars of the Roses. And the feudal system, if you remember, I talked about the feudal system last week a little bit, and I said it was basically a pyramid structure, okay, with the king and the nobles at the top, with knights, soldiers, and priests somewhere in the middle, some merchants, but not very many. And then at the bottom, the serfs, the kind of working in the countryside, growing the food, looking after the animals, and they were more or less in a slave kind of position. They had no freedom in their life. They had to serve the master all their life. By the beginning of Henry's reign, the feudal system, this pyramid structure of society, had broken down a lot. If you watch that video that I made, the longer video about the Chuseiji Dai, this great Chuseiji Dai, there were so many things. There was fighting was one thing that destabilized society. Disease, yoki, okay, pesito. Pesito is actually a gairaigo, maybe from French or Portuguese. In English, it's plague. Plague. ヨーロッパは半分ぐらい死にました。Huge number of people died. Millions and millions of people died. And this meant that the people who didn't die were later on in quite a strong position because people needed workers. The high class needed workers, and people said, you don't pay me enough. I'm going to this other master. Okay, so people started to choose their master. That challenged the old feudal system. So that system was coming to an end, and of course there was a cultural flowering, literature, music. The Renaissance was going on. In the bigger picture of Europe, what you have was the Roman Empire in Italy, where the Roman Empire had been attacked from the north by the kind of Kaiserku wild people, also Germanic, okay, like the Anglo-Saxon people. It had been attacked from the north, and it had basically ended round about 5th century AD. It had continued in the form of the church, okay, and there was some sort of political entity, but more or less the culture of Rome, which carried also the Girisha-no bunka mo haite mashita, they were largely destroyed in Europe at this time. The Roman Empire had its western side and it had its eastern side. The eastern side of the Roman Empire was in Constantinople. Imano Istanbul. Okay, and this also, at the end of the 15th century, or around the 15th century, the Turkish people were invading from the east, and they pushed these people out, and they went to Europe. Many of them ended up going to Italy. Okay, they still had the old Roman and Greek culture. Okay, they still had okay, they had all of this old culture. So that pushed into Italy. Those people, Constantinople, and so this began a Renaissance. Renaissance no imi wa? Rebirth. Naissance is birth in French, and Renaissance means birth again. The rebirth of the classical culture. So that was going on. You know, England is over here, all right. Toi kedo e yappari eikyo ga arimashita. All right, it reached here in its music, in its literature, in its painting. The Renaissance reached England as well. And we talked about last week. The printing press. That was also changing society at this time. The printing press. People could finally read printed books. Before the printing press, most people had no book in their house. Rich people had 1 or 2 books. Some people had more, but typically rich people had 1 or 2 books. One for the church to read, you know, use inside the church for and one was the Bible, Seisho. Okay? Seisho, hito ni yotte, only religious people were allowed to have it. And it was not in English. Now you've got printed books. Oh, and nedan tekini, just as much as a house. One book. Because it was written by hand and it would take about a year to write it. Because it was written beautifully. Alright? especially trained people would write in a very beautiful hand, and it took about a year to write it. These books cost a lot of money. Ordinary people could never have such a book. So now you've got printed books, and everybody, many people can have books. The price goes right down, and it spreads information that people couldn't have before. So that's also changing society. That's also an important thing that's changing and influencing the early Tudor age. Okay, let's look at what kind of rule he had, what kinds of policies he had. First thing he needed was to consolidate his power. We looked at the unstable situation where people would attack the king. He wanted to stop people from attacking him, so he made the law that he was the king before the battle, before fighting against Richard. So everybody who was on the opposite side was automatically his enemy. But he said, you are against the law, I should kill you, but I won't. I'll be nice to you, because you're going to be nice to me, aren't you? Okay? It was a way of keeping them kind of, oh, thank you, because you could kill me, because you made the law that said you were the king before the fighting. So if I fought against you, I was fighting against the king. And that's a crime, the penalty is to die. But the king is a kind king, and he lets me live. So I will always be thankful. Okay? So he kind of bullied some people into following him in that way. So he promised that he wouldn't punish those people even though they fought against him. And he was quite successful internationally. Trade developed at this time. He made trading agreements with France and the Netherlands. Holland. Basically Holland. And he was kind of very organized about collecting tax. And so he attracted money. He made the economy pretty good and peaceful, because if you're buying and selling with another country, you don't fight them. Okay? So he really was quite successful. And he made an important alliance with Scotland. His daughter married the King of Scotland. This is going to become very important later on. This is the beginnings of what will become the Stuart period. So we've got the Tudor family in England. We've got the Scottish family of the Stuarts. And so Henry has a daughter, and the daughter marries the King of Scotland. Okay. Yeah. I couldn't remember Margaret. Okay, she's not really important in herself, but it's important that this marriage is important because later on they will have children, they will have grandchildren. Okay, and one of these later on is going to become the King of England. Okay, so this is an important marriage at this time because of the children, the grandchildren, and the next generations. Okay, Margaret is not very important in herself, but she's important because of the children and the grandchildren and the continuing family. Because in the end, the Tudor family will die out. The last Tudor will have no children, and the family will die out. And the closest relation will be here. So, in the 17th century, the King of England was also the King of Scotland. Okay? But that's 次の話。今の話はTudorのこと。But the Stuarts, the reason that they come into our history is because of this marriage that happens between Henry's daughter and the King of Scotland. And another important marriage is that his son Henry, it says here Arthur, and that's true, okay? So we've got Spain, we've got very, very famous and important King and Queen of Spain at this time, Ferdinand and Isabella, and their daughter Catherine of Aragon, she's called. Henry has several children. One of his first son is Arthur, and again, these two marry. And again, this marriage is going to be very important. Okay? Arthur is going to die, but the marriage is going to be important. This story we'll talk about a little. We'll talk about it a little bit later on today. So these two alliances, the marriage of his daughter and the marriage of his son, these two are very important. Okay. So his legacy, what did he leave after Henry Manasseh, after he died? What was the condition of the country? Well, he was personally very rich because of he was good with money, and the country was rich. Unfortunately, his son Henry Manasseh was the opposite. Money flew away from him, and so most of that money got lost pretty quickly under Henry VIII. And the economy of the country, the same thing. Henry VII, the father, was good with the economy. His son was not. So England went into an economic crisis under the son, mostly because of fighting, seiso no tame. The father avoided wars, and the son enjoyed getting into these fighting, these wars with other European countries. And war is expensive. These two marriages are very important. Okay? The daughter's marriage to James IV, the King of Scotland, meant that the Stuarts had a claim to the English throne, and Elizabeth died with no children, and eventually there was the situation where the King of Scotland would now become the King also of England. And Henry's son Arthur died. So Arthur, bye-bye. And eventually Catherine married the next son, Henry. Okay? So she originally married Arthur, Arthur died, and she married Henry. That situation where Arthur died and she married Henry, that situation is also going to be very important for our story. Okay? So, because that's going to be the next step. Okay. And yeah, Henry's marriage to Catherine is going to be important because their daughter will also become the Queen of England later on. Okay, that's about everything.